A grieving widow, a flaunting mistress, a funeral that becomes a battlefield. For Catherine Davies, her husband Richard's death was supposed to be an ending, a quiet release from a gilded cage. But when his mistress Scarlett Vance laughed in her face beside the open grave, it became a declaration of war. Everyone in the packed church, the titans of industry, and the whispers of high society thought they knew how this story would end, with the younger, bolder woman inheriting everything. They were all wrong. The real battle wasn't for a dead man's heart, but for his secrets, and the only person holding the key was a quiet lawyer about to read the last will and testament. The scent of white lilies was suffocating. It clung to the heavy, damp air inside Blackwood Chapel, a thick, cloying perfume that promised reverence but delivered only a headache. Catherine Davies stood in the front pew, a statue carved from grief and black wool. Her veil, a delicate web of lace, did little to obscure the sharp, dignified lines of her face, but it offered a fragile barrier between her and the prying eyes of the mourners. They had come in droves to see the spectacle, the public farewell to Richard Davies, real estate magnate, philanthropic darling, and as everyone silently acknowledged, a man of cavernous secrets. Catherine felt their gazes like tiny pinpricks on her skin. They weren't looks of sympathy. They were looks of assessment, of ravenous curiosity. How was she holding up? Would she break? And the question that hung unspoken in the incense-laden air, where was she? As if on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel swung open, letting in a slice of watery gray afternoon light. A collective subtle intake of breath rippled through the pews. There, silhouetted against the day, was Scarlett Vance. She was not dressed for mourning. She was dressed for a premiere, a tight, exquisitely tailored black dress that hugged every curve, a wide-brimmed hat tilted at a dramatic angle, and heels that clicked with defiant authority on the ancient stone floor. Her face, a masterpiece of cosmetic artistry, was streaked with perfectly theatrical tears that never dared to smudge her mascara. She wasn't just a mistress. She was an announcement, a walking, breathing scandal. Ignoring the usher's hesitant gesture towards a seat in the back, Scarlett glided down the central aisle, her progress a slow, deliberate performance. Whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves. The audacity! Richard would have loved this. Look at Catherine. She's frozen. Catherine didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the mahogany casket at the altar, on the profusion of lilies that seemed to be breeding in the gloom. She could feel Scarlett's approach, a change in the atmospheric pressure. Then a waft of expensive, aggressive perfume, Jardin d'Amour, Richard's favorite, on her, cut through the funereal scent of the flowers. Scarlett stopped, not beside Catherine, but slightly in front of her, positioning herself just enough to block Catherine's view of the casket. She placed a single blood-red rose on the polished wood, her long crimson nails a stark contrast to the somber setting. Then she turned. Her eyes, a piercing shade of blue, met Catherine's through the veil. There was no sympathy there, no shared grief. There was only triumph. "He loved me, you know." Scarlett whispered, her voice a low, throaty purr, just loud enough for the front pews to hear. "He was mine, this whole thing," she gestured dismissively at the solemn assembly. "It's just a formality. His life was with me." Catherine remained silent. Her hands clasped in front of her were steady. She had spent 2 decades married to Richard Davies. She had learned the art of stillness, of weathering storms, by becoming the stone they broke against. She had survived his moods, his ambitions, his chilling emotional distance. She would survive this. The service began a drone of platitudes and carefully curated memories. The priest spoke of Richard's generosity, his vision for the city, his contributions to the arts, the public Richard, the one chiseled onto building plaques. David Chen, Richard's long-suffering business partner, gave a stilted eulogy, his eyes carefully avoiding both Catherine and Scarlett. He spoke of contracts and foundations of a legacy of steel and glass, never once touching on the man himself. Through it all, Scarlett sobbed. They were loud, gulping sobs that shook her perfect shoulders. She dabbed at her eyes with a black silk handkerchief, a damsel in deep distress. The mourners were captivated. Some looked on in disgust, others with a kind of grudging admiration for her sheer nerve. The true moment of ignition came at the cemetery. The sky wept a miserable drizzle as the casket was lowered into the earth. As the first handful of soil was tossed by the priest, Scarlett stepped forward, her composure finally shattering into something jagged and ugly. "No!" she cried out, lunging toward the grave. "You can't leave me, Ricky! You promised!" Two of Richard's cousins, looking deeply uncomfortable, moved to restrain her. She thrashed in their arms, a wild, beautiful thing consumed by a very public grief. And then she looked directly at Catherine, who stood beside the grave, her face still an impassive mask. A strange, chilling sound escaped Scarlett's lips. It started as a sob, then twisted, contorting into something else entirely. It was a laugh, a raw, hysterical laugh that was part grief, part madness, and part pure, unadulterated victory. "You think you've won!" Scarlett shrieked, her voice echoing across the manicured lawns of the cemetery. "You think this little piece of paper, this marriage, means anything. He's gone. But he left everything that mattered to me, the penthouse, the company, the future. You're just the widow. I was his life." The laughter continued, sharp and brittle, as the cousins finally managed to lead her away. It scraped against the funereal silence, a sound so obscene that people flinched. They looked at Catherine, expecting her to crumble, to scream, to finally show a crack in her porcelain facade. But Catherine Davies simply reached out her gloved hand steady and accepted a white lily from the floral arrangement. She held it for a moment, her gaze fixed on the dark rectangular hole in the ground that had just swallowed the last 20 years of her life. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to cry. The performance was over. The real story was about to begin, and it wouldn't be told in a church or a cemetery, but in the sterile, wood-paneled office of a lawyer named Alastair Finch. And in that room there would be no room for performance, only for the truth. The house was silent. It was a cavernous, oppressive silence that was entirely new. For 20 years, the sprawling estate in Greenwich had been filled with the noise of Richard's existence, his booming voice on the phone, the heavy tread of his expensive shoes on the marble floors, the low hum of the television always tuned to a financial news network. Now the silence was a presence in itself, amplifying the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, the whisper of the wind against the leaded glass windows. Catherine walked through the grand hall, her hand trailing along the cold, polished surface of a mahogany console table. On it sat a collection of framed photographs. Richard with a former president. Richard cutting a ribbon at a hospital wing bearing his name. Richard and Catherine on their wedding day, two strangers smiling for the camera, he with a look of possession, she with a look of hopeful terror. There were no photos of Richard and Scarlett. Richard was a master of compartmentalization. His public life was pristine. She entered his study, the heart of his empire, within their home. It smelled of him, leather-expensive scotch, and the faint metallic scent of ambition. Nothing had been touched since he'd left that final morning. A crystal glass with a film of amber liquid sat on his massive oak desk. A stack of papers, the Argus Tower deal, was held down by a heavy brass paperweight shaped like a bull. Catherine had always hated that bull. It was a perfect brutish symbol of how he'd conducted his life. She sank into his deep leather chair, the seat still holding the faint impression of his form. It felt like sitting in a ghost's lap. It was here in this room that their marriage had truly died, not with a bang, but with 1,000 quiet cuts. She remembered the early years. She had been a promising art historian working at a small but respected gallery. He had been a cyclone of charisma and power sweeping into her life, promising her the world. She had been dazzled not by the money, but by the sheer force of his will. He seemed like a man who could bend reality to his liking. She had mistaken that power for strength. The change was gradual. At first, it was subtle suggestions. "That gallery job is a nice hobby, Kate, but you don't need it. Your place is with me." Then came the isolation. "These old college friends of yours, they're so pedestrian. They don't understand our world." He built this magnificent house for her, a palace of polished surfaces and empty rooms, and then locked the gates. It wasn't a home, it was a display case. She was his most beautiful, most placid acquisition. Her own passions were dismissed. When she tried to set up a small studio in a spare room, he'd surprised her by having it converted into a state-of-the-art gym he never used. "Art is for looking at darling, not for making a mess," he'd said with a patronizing smile. The suspicions of infidelity had started a decade ago, a lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on his suit jacket. Late-night business meetings that stretched until dawn, a credit card bill with a charge for a jeweler she had never visited. When she confronted him, he deployed his most potent weapon, gaslighting. "You're being hysterical, Catherine. Are you unwell? Perhaps you should talk to someone." He would say, his voice a calm, chilling balm of condescension. He made her feel as if her own intuition was a form of madness. He would spin tales of business pressures and demanding clients so elaborate, so detailed, that she would begin to doubt her own senses. For a time, she believed him, or more accurately, she chose to. To accept the truth would have meant dismantling the entire artifice of her life, and she hadn't had the strength. Then came Scarlett, about 5 years ago. This one was different. She wasn't a secret, she was a statement. He flaunted her at restaurants just outside their usual social circuit. He bought her a penthouse apartment on the other side of town, an open secret whispered about at cocktail parties Catherine was forced to attend. Scarlett wasn't just an affair. She was a parallel life, a second, more vibrant narrative running alongside his staid, respectable marriage. Why had she stayed? Olivia, her one remaining friend from her old life, had asked her that question 100 times. "Leave him, Kate. You have your own trust fund from your parents. It's not enormous, but it's enough. You can start over." But it wasn't that simple. Catherine would look at Richard, at the empire he had built, and see the scared, ambitious boy he had once been, the one she'd caught glimpses of in their first year together. A part of her pitied him. Another part was terrified of him. He had woven their finances, their social standing, their entire lives into a tapestry so complex that pulling a single thread felt like it would unravel everything. He had once told her during a particularly cold argument, "You'll never leave me, Catherine, because you are in every legal and practical sense me. Without me, you are nothing." He had meant it as a threat. But sitting there in the deafening silence of his empty study, she realized it might also be a clue. She stood up and walked to the towering bookshelf that covered one entire wall. It was filled with leather-bound classics he had never read, and biographies of great men he admired. But behind a row of matching encyclopedias, she knew was a safe. She had seen him used it only a handful of times, always with a furtive, secretive air. She had never known the combination. It didn't matter now. Whatever was in there was part of his estate, and Alistair Finch would have it opened. Her fingers brushed against a small, framed photo tucked away on a lower shelf, almost hidden. It was from a holiday in Italy, early in their marriage. They were on a balcony overlooking Lake Como. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her face unguarded, and genuinely happy. He was looking at her, not the camera, and for a fleeting moment the man in the photograph wasn't a magnate or a monster. He was just a husband. A single hot tear finally escaped, tracing a path down her cold cheek. It wasn't a tear for the man who had died, the cruel architect of her gilded cage. It was a tear for the woman in the photograph, the one who had believed in him. It was a tear for the life that had been stolen from her, not by Scarlett, but by the man they were both now fighting over. She straightened her back, wiping the tear away with a resolute swipe of her finger. The grief was real, but it was for herself. Richard had made his choices. He had lived his life and his second life with unapologetic selfishness. Now, he was gone. And for the first time in 20 years, the silence in the house didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a possibility. It felt like the clean, quiet air before a storm, yes, but also the stillness before a brand new day. The offices of Finch, Abernathy, and Cole were the physical embodiment of old money and discretion. Located in a pre-war building overlooking Central Park, the space was a hushed sanctuary of polished mahogany-worn Persian rugs and the faint, pleasant scent of aging paper and lemon oil. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of the secrets it had absorbed over the decades. Catherine arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by her friend Olivia, who had insisted on being there for moral support. Catherine wore a simple navy blue dress, her only adornment the thin gold wedding band she still hadn't brought herself to remove. She was the picture of quiet composure, a stark contrast to the scene they walked into. Scarlett Vance was already there holding court in the center of the waiting room. She was dressed in a sharp, cream-colored pantsuit, a deliberate and defiant rejection of traditional mourning attire. She was flanked by a slick young lawyer who looked more like a shark than a man of jurisprudence. Scarlett was speaking in a loud, confident voice to Richard's mother, Margaret Davies, a woman who looked as if she'd been chiseled from a block of granite. "Margaret, darling, you must come and see what I've done with the penthouse," Scarlett was saying, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "Ricky always said the decor was a bit too, well, stuffy. I've brought in a designer from Milan. It's much more us." Margaret Davies, a formidable matriarch whose approval Richard had chased his entire life, looked down her nose at Scarlett with undisguised disdain. "My son," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "had many appetites. I am not required to find all of them tasteful." Scarlett's smile faltered for a microsecond before she recovered. "Oh, Margaret, always so droll. You'll come around once you see how happy he was with me." Just then, David Chen Richards' business partner arrived. He was a meticulous man. His suit perfectly pressed his face a neutral mask. He nodded curtly at Margaret and Scarlett, his eyes flicking briefly to Catherine with a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. He took a seat as far away from the two women as possible, opening his briefcase and pretending to study a document. The tension in the room was thick enough to be a physical presence. It was a clashing of worlds. The old established world of Margaret and Catherine, built on tradition and propriety, and the new flashy world of Scarlet, built on ambition and audacity. At precisely 10:15, the door to the inner office opened. A tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and piercing gray eyes emerged. This was Alistair Finch. He had been the Davies family lawyer for 40 years, having first worked for Richard's father. He exuded an aura of unshakable calm and authority. "Good morning," he said, his voice dry as parchment. "If you would all please come in." He led them into a large, book-lined conference room. A massive polished table dominated the space, reflecting the grim faces of the assembly. Finch took his seat at the head of the table, placing a thick, leather-bound folder before him. He gestured for the others to sit. Catherine and Olivia sat on one side of the table. Margaret Davies sat on the other, her back ramrod straight. David Chen sat beside her, looking deeply uncomfortable. Scarlet, with a theatrical flourish, pulled out the chair directly opposite Catherine, her young lawyer taking the seat next to her. She leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table, a predatory gleam in her eyes. It was a clear, unspoken challenge. Finch put on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses and cleared his throat. The sound was unnervingly loud in the silent room. "We are gathered here today," he began, his tone formal and devoid of emotion, "for the reading of the last will and testament of Richard Harold Davies, executed on the 5th of January 2024. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over each person at the table. "I must advise you that the contents are as per Mr. Davies's instructions to be considered final and legally binding. Any emotional outbursts will not alter the facts laid out in this document, and I will ask anyone who cannot maintain their composure to leave." His eyes rested on Scarlet for a fraction of a second longer than anyone else. Scarlet simply smirked a small, confident smile that said she had nothing to fear. She subtly adjusted the massive diamond ring on her left hand, a ring Catherine knew for a fact was not from Richard's usual jeweler. She was the picture of smug certainty, the cat who had not only gotten the cream, but also owned the dairy. Catherine felt Olivia's hand gently squeeze her arm under the table. She took a slow, deep breath. She looked at the faces around her. Margaret, a mother who had lost her son, but seemed more concerned with the family's reputation. David, a partner who was likely worried about the future of the company he had helped build. And Scarlet, a woman so convinced of her own narrative that she couldn't imagine any other reality. And then there was Catherine, the wife, the relic, the woman everyone assumed was about to be publicly humiliated and cast aside. She looked at Alistair Finch, at his impassive, lawyerly face. He held the story of Richard's life and death in his hands. Whatever was in that folder, it would be the truth. Or at least it would be Richard's final version of it. For the first time since that horrible phone call from the hospital, Catherine didn't feel dread. She felt a strange, detached curiosity. She was no longer a participant in Richard's drama. She was an observer waiting for the final act to unfold. The storm had gathered. Now, it was about to break. Alistair Finch adjusted his glasses, the slight movement seeming to command the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He untied the silk ribbon around the thick document and opened it. The crisp crackle of the heavy paper was the only sound. "I, Richard Harold Davies." Finch began reading, his voice a steady, dispassionate monotone. "Being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all former wills and codicils." He continued through the standard legal preamble, the words washing over the room in a dull wave. Catherine focused on a point on the polished table, tracing the wood grain with her eyes, bracing herself. Across from her, Scarlett was practically vibrating with anticipation, her smirk fixed in place. Her lawyer whispered something to her, and she nodded, her confidence radiating like heat. First, Finch read, "I direct my executor to pay all my just debt's funeral expenses and the costs of the administration of my estate." He paused, taking a sip of water from a glass that had been placed before him. The pause felt deliberate, a small piece of theater. "Second, to my beloved mother, Margaret Eleanor Davies, I bequeath the sum of $1 million to be paid from my personal accounts, along with my collection of antique clocks, in gratitude for her lifelong guidance." Margaret's expression did not change. It was a substantial sum, but likely less than she had expected. She gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a business transaction had been completed to a satisfactory, if underwhelming, degree. Third, to my loyal friend and business partner, David Chen. I bequeath my complete share of ownership in our jointly held consulting firm, Chen Davies Analytics, as well as a personal gift of $500,000 in recognition of his tireless work and dedication, without which our primary ventures would not have been possible. David Chen looked genuinely surprised. He blinked several times, his professional mask slipping to reveal a flicker of emotion. He had clearly expected to have to negotiate the buyout of Richard's shares. He looked over at Catherine and gave a small, almost apologetic nod. He had been a beneficiary of Richard's planning. Finch turned a page. Catherine's heart began to beat a little faster. This was it. The main bequests were next. The properties, the stocks, the core of the fortune. Scarlett leaned forward even further, her blue eyes gleaming. Her lawyer gave her a confident pat on the arm. This was their moment. "Fourth," Finch announced, his voice steady, "to Ms. Scarlett Vance." He paused again, looking directly at Scarlett over the top of his glasses. The room held its breath. "To Ms. Scarlett Vance," he repeated, "I bequeath the property located at 1400 Park Avenue, Penthouse B, with all of its contents, furnishings, and art, to be hers completely, and without encumbrance from my estate." A triumphant, audible sigh escaped Scarlett's lips. Her lawyer beamed. This was it. The multi-million-dollar penthouse, the symbol of their life together. It was hers. She shot a venomous, victorious look at Catherine. See, her eyes screamed. "I told you. I was his life." But Finch hadn't finished. He was still reading. "I also bequeath to Ms. Vance the 2023 Bentley Continental GT currently registered in my name and housed in the Park Avenue garage, and the contents of the savings account ending in the numbers 4758 at the First National Bank of New York, which as of the date of this will contains approximately $250,000. It was a staggering gift. The penthouse alone was worth over $10 million. The car, another $250,000. Plus the cash. Scarlett's victory was complete. She sat back in her chair, a queen surveying her conquered territory. She looked almost bored now, as if the rest of the reading was a mere formality. Olivia's hand found Catherine's again under the table, giving it a comforting squeeze. Catherine braced herself for what was to come next, the pittance, the charitable trust in her name, the polite but firm financial dismissal that would finalize her public humiliation. Finch turned another page. His expression remained utterly unreadable. "Fifth," he said, and the room, which had relaxed slightly after Scarlett's bequest, grew tense again. "Regarding my wife, Catherine Marie Davies." Scarlett let out a tiny, almost inaudible scoff. She began examining her perfectly manicured nails, feigning disinterest. "To my wife, Catherine," Finch read, "I bequeath our primary residence at 212 Overlook Lane, Greenwich, Connecticut, with all its contents and the adjacent 20 acres of land." It was expected. The house was legally half hers anyway. It was the cage Richard had built for her, and now it was hers to keep. It felt less like a gift, and more like a life sentence. "I also bequeath to her my art collection housed at the Greenwich residence, with the exception of the Warhol, which is to be sold, with proceeds going to the estate." He continued, "She is to receive a lifetime stipend of $100,000 per year to be managed and dispersed by a trust administered by my executor." $100,000 a year. It sounded like a lot of money to most people, but in the world she inhabited, it was an insult. It was enough to maintain the house, but not the lifestyle. It was enough to keep her comfortable, but powerless. It was a golden leash, Richard's final act of control from beyond the grave. Scarlett didn't even bother to hide her smile now. She had the penthouse, the car, the cash, the glamorous city life. Catherine was left with an empty mansion in the suburbs and an allowance. The battle was over. The Mistress had won. "Finally," Finch said, looking up from the document, "the remainder of my estate, including all stocks, bonds, investment portfolios, commercial properties, and controlling shares in Davies Holdings International, shall be placed into the Richard H. Davies Charitable Foundation to be overseen by a board of directors. The founding members of this board will be my mother, Margaret Davies, my partner, David Chen, and—" Finch paused. "Ms. Scarlett Vance." The blood drained from David Chen's face. Margaret Davies looked apoplectic, her mouth a thin, hard line. Scarlett, however, looked as though she had just been crowned. Not only had she received the personal gifts, but she was now in control of the entire business empire alongside the Dragon Lady Mother and the stooge partner. She held all the cards. Her gaze fell upon Catherine, and the triumphant smirk blossomed into a full, radiant smile of pure, malevolent joy. It was a look that said everything she had screamed at the funeral. "You are nothing. He was mine. It's all mine." The testament had been read. The story, it seemed, was over. A thick, stunned silence filled the conference room. Margaret Davies looked as if she'd swallowed acid. David Chen was pale, staring at Alistair Finch as if the lawyer had just announced the sky was turning green. Scarlett, in contrast, was glowing. She was subtly texting on her phone under the table, likely announcing her victory to the world. "Well," Scarlett said, breaking the silence as she placed her phone face down with a decisive click, "I must say Ricky always was a generous man. I'll be sure to run the foundation just as he would have wanted. Aggressively." Her lawyer began packing his briefcase, the snap of the latches echoing like gunshots. "If there is nothing further, Mr. Finch, my client has a great deal to attend to." "Please remain seated," Finch said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. The lawyer froze his hands, hovering over his briefcase. Scarlett's triumphant expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "The reading of the primary will is complete." Finch continued, looking at them all over his glasses. "However, there are some administrative matters tied to the bequests that require immediate clarification." He slid a thin folder across the table towards Scarlett's lawyer. "This pertains to the Park Avenue property. It is, as stated, bequeathed to Ms. Vance. However, the property carries a significant mortgage which Mr. Davies took out against it 8 months ago." The outstanding principal is approximately $7.2 million. As the new owner, Ms. Vance is now, of course, responsible for that debt. The color drained from Scarlett's face. What, that's impossible. Ricky owned that place outright. He told me he did. Mr. Davies was creative with his finances, Finch said dryly. The bank holds the lien. The documents are all in order. And Scarlett's lawyer quickly opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. His confident demeanor evaporated, replaced by a look of growing horror. He leaned over and whispered frantically in Scarlett's ear. $7 million? She squawked, her voice suddenly shrill. But the apartment is only worth 10, and the maintenance fees are over $20,000 a month. I can't afford that. That is a matter for you and the bank to discuss, Finch replied coolly. He then turned to David Chen. David, regarding the company Davies Holdings. You, Ms. Vance, and Mrs. Davies are indeed the board of the foundation which will inherit it. But you should be aware that the company is currently leveraged to an extraordinary degree. Richard funded his last 3 acquisitions with high-interest, short-term loans. The company's liquid assets are negligible. In fact, he paused, consulting a sheet of paper. Davies Holdings is facing a debt service payment of $15 million due in 90 days. Failure to meet that payment will result in the forfeiture of the company's primary assets to its creditors. David Chen slumped in his chair, running a hand over his face. $15 million. We don't have that. We were counting on the Argus Tower deal too. The Argus Tower deal collapsed the morning Mr. Davies died, Finch stated flatly. The investors pulled out. That I am given to understand is what precipitated his cardiac event. The empire was a house of cards. Richard hadn't been a king sitting on a throne of gold. He'd been a gambler on a losing streak, pushing all his chips into the center of the table for one last, desperate hand. And he had lost. Scarlett was staring at Finch, her mouth slightly agape, the triumphant queen suddenly looking like a peasant who'd been handed a bill for the crown jewels. The penthouse was a trap. The company was a sinking ship. The beautiful, glamorous life he had promised her was an illusion, a stage set that was now being dismantled around her. What about the cash? She stammered, pointing a trembling, crimson-nailed finger at the will. The bank account, the $250,000. Finch adjusted his glasses. Ah, yes. That account is solvent. However, Mr. Davies also had a number of personal credit lines and unsecured loans. As executor, I am required to settle those debts first. The contents of that account will be entirely consumed by payments to American Express, his tailor, and a certain jeweler in the Diamond District who, it seems, specialized in exceptionally high-quality replicas. He let that last statement hang in the air. Scarlett instinctively looked down at the massive diamond on her finger. Her face, already pale, turned a ghostly white. The rock on her hand, her ultimate symbol of victory, was a fake. A lie, just like everything else. The laughter from the funeral, that sound of raw, hysterical triumph, now seemed like a pathetic, distant echo. The thread of her victory had not just unraveled, it had been revealed to be rotten from the start. Catherine watched not with pleasure, but with a kind of weary recognition. This was Richard's final, cruelest trick. He had given his mistress everything she'd ever wanted, but he'd made it all worthless. He had promised her a kingdom and handed her a pile of dust and debt. He had managed to control and punish her even from the grave. This is ridiculous. Scarlett finally exploded, standing up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. He loved me. He wouldn't do this to me. You're lying. This is some trick. She turned on Catherine, her eyes wild with fury and desperation. This is your doing. You poisoned him against me. Ms. Vance, I must insist you sit down, Finch said, his voice rising in authority for the first time. I am not finished. I don't care if you're finished, Scarlett shrieked, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered. He told me I was his future. He wouldn't leave me with a mountain of debt and a fake ring. This will is a fraud. Her lawyer, looking utterly defeated, tugged on her sleeve. Scarlett, please, let the man speak. There is more, Margaret Davies asked, her voice sharp. She had watched Scarlett's humiliation with cold satisfaction, but the news of her son's financial ruin had clearly shaken her. The family name was now attached to a bankrupt enterprise. Indeed, Alistair Finch said. He reached inside the leather-bound folder and extracted a separate smaller envelope sealed with a wax stamp bearing the Davies family crest. This is a codicil to the will. It was executed 3 months ago and delivered to me by Mr. Davies personally, with instructions that it was to be opened only after the primary will had been read in its entirety. He cracked the seal with a neat flick of his thumb, the sound snapping through the tense room. He unfolded a single sheet of paper. This codicil, he announced, amends and supersedes certain clauses of the main testament. Scarlett froze, a desperate, wild hope dawning in her eyes. See, he changed it. He fixed it for me. Finch ignored her. He began to read. Codicil to the last will and testament of Richard Harold Davies, dated July 14th, 2025. His eyes scanned the room before continuing. Let this document clarify my intentions, free from the performance required in my primary will. The bequests made in that document to Ms. Scarlett Vance were a transaction of final payment for services rendered. The debts attached to those gifts are a lesson in the true cost of things. Scarlett let out a strangled gasp, as if she'd been physically struck. Finch continued reading Richard's cold, posthumous words. The Davies Holdings Company is, as my partner David knows, a shell game. I played it well for a long time. It is now a husk. I leave its fate to the board I have named. Let them fight over the bones. Margaret Davies closed her eyes, her face a mask of grim resignation. The public humiliation she had feared for the family name was now a certainty. My true legacy. Finch read his voice, taking on a slightly different cadence, as if the tone of the writing itself had shifted, is not in buildings or bank accounts accessible to creditors. It is secured elsewhere, and its stewardship falls to the only person I ever truly misjudged. Every eye in the room turned to Catherine. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play about her own life. Finch cleared his throat. The clause in my will regarding my wife, Catherine Marie Davies, is hereby struck. The provision of the Greenwich House and the insulting stipend are null and void. Scarlett stared, her mind unable to process this new turn. Was Catherine being thrown out with nothing in its place? Finch read the final paragraphs of Richard's last words. I declare the following to be the truth. 15 years ago, on the advice of my father's financial planners, I established an independent offshore trust to shield my core assets from the volatility of my business dealings. It was called the Kensington Trust. To legally separate it from my own name and protect it from any future litigation or bankruptcy proceedings, it had to be placed in another's name. I chose my wife, Catherine. Catherine's breath hitched. She remembered it now. A mountain of paperwork 15 years ago. Richard had called it estate planning, something to do with taxes. He had been charming patient, guiding her hand as she signed page after page, never explaining, just smiling, his reassuring, controlling smile. "It's just a formality, darling." "The Kensington Trust," Finch continued reading, "was seeded with my entire personal fortune at the time. Every subsequent dividend from my profitable ventures, every bonus, every cent that was not immediately funneled back into the precarious shell game of Davies Holdings was deposited into that trust. The trust's assets were managed by a discreet firm in Switzerland, and as per the articles of its creation articles, my wife signed the sole beneficiary and controller of the trust, with absolute and irrevocable power, is its namesake. Catherine Marie Davies. The room was utterly deathly silent. "I did this believing I would always control her, and by extension the trust," Richard's statement concluded. "I saw her quietness as weakness, her dignity as passivity. I was wrong. It was strength. She is the only part of my life I did not manage to corrupt or ruin. The assets of the Kensington Trust are not part of my estate. They are not subject to my debts. They are and always have been, legally and completely hers. As of my death, the Swiss firm will report only to her. The estimated value of the Trust's assets as of the 1st of this month is $357 million. The number hung in the air, an impossible gravitational weight. $357 million. Olivia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. David Chen stared at Catherine with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. Margaret Davies's jaw was slack, her icy composure finally shattered. And Scarlett Vance simply collapsed into her chair, her face a grotesque mask of disbelief and horror. The penthouse, the company, the fake diamond. It was all dust, scraps from the table. The entire time she had been playing for the kingdom, she hadn't realized that the quiet, invisible woman across the table already owned the entire world. Alistair Finch neatly folded the codicil and placed it on the table. He looked at Catherine, and for the first time a glimmer of something human, something like respect, appeared in his lawyerly eyes. "Congratulations, Mrs. Davies," he said softly. "It would appear you have inherited everything that was real." The aftermath was not an explosion, but a slow, silent collapse. Scarlett Vance did not scream or rage. All the fire, all the audacious energy seemed to have been sucked out of her, leaving a hollow shell. She stared blankly at Catherine, her mind clearly struggling to reconcile the reality of the last 5 minutes with the victorious narrative she had lived in for the last 5 years. Her young lawyer, pale and shaken, helped her to her feet. She walked out of this conference room like a zombie, her defiant click-clack heels now a stumbling, uncertain shuffle. The doors swung shut behind her, sealing off the end of her story. Margaret Davies was the next to stir. She rose from her chair with a pained stiffness every one of her years, suddenly visible on her face. She looked at Catherine, her expression a complex mixture of shock, resentment, and a strange, grudging deference. The power in the family had shifted irrevocably. The woman she had always viewed as a decorative but inconsequential daughter-in-law was now the matriarch. "Catherine." Margaret said the name sounding foreign on her lips. She seemed to want to say more, perhaps to extend an olive branch or make a demand, but the words wouldn't come. She simply gave a short, jerky nod and swept out of the room, her pride, the only thing she had left. David Chen remained. He walked over to Catherine, his face etched with a weary relief. "He was a brilliant monster, wasn't he?" David said quietly, shaking his head. "He built a labyrinth and left everyone to die in it, but you. I'm glad it was you, Catherine, for what it's worth." "Thank you, David," she replied, her voice steady, though her mind was still reeling. If you want to use some of your capital to salvage the company, to save the employees' jobs." He started, then stopped himself. "I'm sorry. That's not my place. It's your decision now. All of it." He gave her a small, respectful bow and departed, leaving Catherine alone with Olivia and Alistair Finch. The lawyer began stacking his papers into a neat pile. "The Swiss firm Zurich Sterling Partners will be expecting your call. They have been managing the trust for 15 years. They are exceptionally discreet. Here is the direct contact information for your portfolio manager, Mr. Brandt." He slid a card across the table. "You are an exceptionally wealthy woman, Mrs. Davies. You will require a new team of financial and legal advisors. My firm would be honored to—" "No, thank you, Mr. Finch," Catherine said, the words coming to her with surprising clarity. "I think I'll be starting completely fresh." Finch nodded, unfazed. "As you wish. My duties as executor of Richard's other estate will continue. It will be a messy affair untangling the debts." As Catherine and Olivia stood to leave, Finch spoke one last time. "Mrs. Davies, for what it's worth, I knew Richard's father. He always said his son's greatest flaw was that he could never recognize true value. He was right." Walking out of the building and into the bright New York City afternoon felt like stepping into a different world. The city noise, the blur of taxis, the rush of people, it all seemed new, vibrant. Olivia hugged her tightly. "Kate, I have no words. Are you okay?" Catherine looked up at the sky, a brilliant, clear blue. "I think I will be," she said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in years. "I think I finally will be." She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vengeful. The money was staggering, almost abstract, but it wasn't the source of the lightness she felt in her soul. The money wasn't the victory. The truth was the victory. The knowledge that her quiet endurance had not been foolishness. Her dignity, which Richard had mistaken for weakness, had been her shield. He had tried to imprison her in a gilded cage, but all along she had held the key. He just never thought she would know how to use it. They hailed a cab, but Catherine didn't give the driver the address for the Greenwich mansion. That was a mausoleum of a life that was no longer hers. "Take us to the West Village, please," she said, "near the art galleries." As the cab pulled into traffic, Olivia looked at her, a question in her eyes. "What are you going to do now, Kate?" Catherine thought for a moment, watching the city flash by. She thought of the smell of oil paints and turpentine, of the feel of a fresh canvas, of the woman she had been before Richard Davies had acquired her. "I think," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, thrilling sense of possibility, "I'm going to buy a small gallery, and then I'm going to get my hands very, very dirty." The wealth wasn't a prize. It was a tool. It was the freedom she had been denied for 2 decades. The freedom to create, to build something of her own, to live a life that wasn't a reflection of a powerful man, but was entirely, unapologetically hers. The sun streamed through the window of the cab, and for the first time, Catherine felt its warmth not just on her skin, but deep within her bones. It was the dawn of a different, better day. 6 months later, the scent of lilies and old money was a distant memory, replaced by the smell of plaster dust, old wood, and the promise of fresh paint. Catherine stood in the middle of a cavernous, sun-drenched space in the West Village. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling front windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes like tiny dancing diamonds. The walls were scarred from decades of previous tenants, the hardwood floors scuffed and worn. To anyone else, it was a wreck. To Catherine, it was the most beautiful room in the world. She was not the woman who had sat in Alistair Finch's office. The designer morning dress was long gone, replaced by worn jeans, a simple white linen shirt, and practical boots. There was a smudge of dust on her cheek, and her hair was tied back in a simple, unstudied knot. She was no longer Mrs. Richard Davies, a carefully curated appendage to a powerful man. She was just Catherine. Earlier that morning, while grabbing a coffee, her eyes had snagged on a tabloid headline at a newsstand. A grainy photo of Scarlett Vance looking haggard and thin was splashed across the front page. From penthouse to eviction notice, Richard Davies's mistress loses it all. The article detailed how she had been forced into bankruptcy, hounded by the creditors of the company she had briefly helped oversee, and was now selling off her possessions to pay legal fees. The replica diamond ring had reportedly fetched less than $1,000 at a pawn shop. Catherine had felt a brief, surprising pang of something that wasn't triumph, but a weary pity. Scarlett had been just another one of Richard's acquisitions, and like all the others, she had been disposable. "It's got good bones, but it needs a lot of work," the real estate agent said, tapping a wall skeptically. "We could probably get the seller to come down another 10%. But Catherine ran her hand along a rough brick wall, feeling the history under her fingertips. "No, the price is fine," she said, her voice clear and decisive. "I'll take it, and I'll pay in cash. Please have the papers drawn up by the end of the day." The agent's jaw dropped. He had been trying to sell this dilapidated space for a year. Catherine turned a slow smile touching her lips as she surveyed her new domain. She envisioned it all: the walls pristine white, the floors sanded and polished to a warm glow, track lighting perfectly angled to illuminate the bold, vibrant canvases she would hang. She wouldn't be showing established masters or chasing the artists Richard had once collected as investments. Her gallery, the Davies Gallery. She would keep the name, but on her own terms now would be a haven for the unknown, the brilliant, the struggling. It would be a place for people who, like the old Catherine, had a voice, but had never been given a room in which to use it. The money, that ridiculous, impossible number, no longer felt like Richard's. He had created the trust as another form of control, a secret vault he could command through her. He had miscalculated. His final convoluted act wasn't a gift or an apology. It was simply a mistake. His motives had died with him, and Catherine felt no need to analyze them. The only thing that mattered was the here and now. The money was a tool, and for the first time in her life, she was the one holding it. Standing in the center of the empty room, bathed in the afternoon light, Catherine felt the last phantom weight of her old life lift from her shoulders. This was her blank canvas, and she couldn't wait to begin. Catherine's story is a powerful reminder that dignity is not weakness, and the quietest person in the room often holds the most power. It's a tale of betrayal, but also one of unexpected vindication, and the strength it takes to reclaim your own life from the ashes of another's lies. The true inheritance wasn't the money. It was the freedom to finally be herself. What would you have done in her position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story of justice served cold, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a good tale of twists and turns, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update on the intricate dramas that remind us truth is always the most valuable asset. The storm wasn't just in the sky. It was in her soul. A drenched photograph was all Ava Patterson had left of her family, its edges blurring into a pulp in her trembling hands. Across the street, The Caldwell Tower pierced the weeping clouds, a monument to the man who had shattered her world. Inside, her husband Damien was toasting his new life with his new woman, oblivious to the fact that his children were fading. Ava had lost her home, her dignity, and her hope. But as the rain washed over her, she made a promise. He would not take her children too. She would walk through hell and high water to save them, even if it meant facing him one last time. The eviction notice was a stark white slash against the peeling paint of the apartment door. It felt less like paper and more like a final judgment. Ava Patterson stared at the bold, unforgiving letters, her breath catching in her throat. The words blurred as rain from her soaked hair dripped onto the page, mimicking the tears she refused to let fall. Just 18 months ago, her world had been a sun-drenched penthouse overlooking the city. It had been filled with the scent of Damien's expensive cologne, the sound of their twin children's laughter echoing on marble floors, and the easy, comfortable rhythm of a life she believed was unbreakable. Damien Caldwell, the tech magnate whose face graced business magazines, had been her Damien. The man she'd met in a crowded university library, the one who'd shared instant noodles with her while mapping out his empire on a napkin. She had been his foundation, his partner, his wife. Now she was just the woman he'd left behind. The apartment she'd managed to find was a world away from that life. It was a cramped two-bedroom unit in a run-down part of the city where the symphony of sirens replaced the gentle hum of a climate-controlled high-rise. The rent was a mountain she could barely climb each month, cobbled together from a part-time job at a local bakery and the dwindling remnants of her pride. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and sickness. 5-year-old Noah was curled on the worn-out sofa, a damp cloth on his forehead, his breathing shallow. His sister Sophie sat beside him, her own small face pale, her usual vibrant energy dimmed to a flicker. They had what the doctors initially called a persistent, aggressive flu. Then it became a concerning immune deficiency. Now it was a terrifying string of letters and numbers, XALed, a rare genetic disorder that was insidiously attacking their small bodies. Mommy Sophie's voice was a whisper. "Is Noah sleeping again?" Ava forced a smile, her heart twisting. "He's just resting, sweetie, so his body can get strong." She knelt, feeling Sophie's forehead. Warm. Too warm. The doctor's words from yesterday echoed in her mind. "The standard treatments aren't effective enough, Mrs. Patterson. There's an experimental gene therapy protocol. The success rate is promising, but the cost is astronomical. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars per child. Hundreds of thousands." She had exactly $412 in her bank account. When Damien had left, his lawyers had been swift and brutal. They'd called it a generous settlement, but it was a pittance compared to his multi-billion-dollar fortune. It had been enough to secure this apartment and survive for a few months, but it was a leaky lifeboat in the middle of an ocean, and it was sinking fast. He had cut her off not just financially, but emotionally. Her calls went to his assistant. Her emails were met with automated replies. He had built a fortress around his new life, and she was left outside in the cold. She looked at the photo on the small, cluttered side table, the last one taken of them as a family. They were at a beach house in the Hamptons. Damien was holding Noah on his shoulders. Sophie was in Ava's arms, and they were all laughing, their faces lit by a perfect sunset. It felt like a scene from someone else's life. A violent cough from the sofa ripped her from the memory. Noah was shaking his face, scrunched in pain. Ava rushed to his side, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had spent countless nights watching her child suffer. She soothed him, whispered empty reassurances, and held his small, frail hand until the fit subsided. As he drifted back into a restless sleep, Ava looked from his pale face to Sophie's worried eyes. This wasn't just about the eviction notice anymore. This was a race against time, a battle she couldn't possibly win with the resources she had. Her gaze drifted to the window, to the distant glittering spire of the Caldwell Tower. He was up there in his glass castle with her. Jessica Montgomery, the sleek, ambitious publicist who had entered their lives professionally and then systematically dismantled them personally. Desperation was a cold, sharp thing. It stripped away pride, silenced reason, and left only a raw, primal instinct. She had to save her children, and there was only one person in the world who had the means to do it. Swallowing the bitter taste of humiliation, Ava knew what she had to do. She had to go to him. She had to beg. For Noah and Sophie, she would crawl if she had to. The champagne flute felt cool and elegant in Jessica Montgomery's perfectly manicured hand. From the 80th floor wraparound balcony of Damien Caldwell's penthouse, the city below was a sprawling tapestry of glittering lights. It was her kingdom now, and Damien was her king. The floral arrangements from Preston Bailey are confirmed, the catering by Jean-Georges is set, and the string quartet will be playing Vivaldi as the guests arrive, she said, her voice smooth as silk. She turned to Damien, a dazzling smile playing on her lips. The Caldwell Foundation Charity Gala is going to be the event of the year. It will completely redefine your public image. Damien stood by the railing, his back to her, staring down at the city. He wasn't listening. He was thinking. Or rather, he was actively trying not to think. "Good," he murmured, his voice flat. "Whatever you think is best, Jessica." Jessica's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. She hated when he got like this, distant, moody. It was usually when something reminded him of his old life. She had worked tirelessly for over a year to scrub every trace of Ava from this penthouse from his life. She'd replaced the muted, comfortable furniture with stark, modern pieces. She'd swapped the family photos for abstract art. She had even convinced him to change the passcode on his private elevator, a code he had once shared with his ex-wife. She walked towards him, her designer dress shimmering under the recessed lighting, and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind. "Is something wrong, darling?" Damien flinched slightly at her touch before relaxing into it. "Just a lot on my mind with the new merger." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The merger was a done deal. What was really on his mind were the 2 unanswered emails from Ava's lawyer that his own attorney, Mr. Thompson, had forwarded to him this morning. They were about escalating medical bills. He had instructed Thompson to handle it, to just pay whatever it was and make it go away. He didn't want the details. The details made it real. "Forget the merger," Jessica cooed, pressing a kiss to his shoulder blade. "Think about us. About our future." She placed her hand on her own flat stomach, a gesture full of meaning. "About the new life we're creating." This was her trump card, her ultimate victory. A month ago, she had announced she was pregnant. It was the final nail in the coffin of Damien's past, the anchor that would secure his future to her permanently. The news had for a time shaken him out of his guilt-ridden stupor. A new child, a fresh start, a chance to do it right this time. But doubt, like a persistent weed, kept creeping back in. He remembered Noah's fascination with circuit boards and Sophie's surprisingly sharp wit. He remembered bedtime stories and scraped knees. He had loved them. A part of him, a part he kept locked away, still did. But Jessica had convinced him that Ava was using them as weapons, poisoning them against him, turning them into pawns in a messy divorce. It was cleaner, she'd argued, to make a clean break. His financial support was more than enough. "You're right," he said, turning to face her, his expression softening as he looked at her. She was beautiful, ambitious, and uncomplicated. She didn't challenge him or make him feel a shred of the inadequacy Ava sometimes had with her quiet strength and moral compass. Jessica simply reflected his own greatness back at him. It was intoxicating. "This gala is important," Jessica continued, sensing she had regained his attention. "It's about showing the world the new Damien Caldwell, a philanthropist, a visionary, a family man." She smiled again, that brilliant, calculated smile. My family. Suddenly, Damien's phone buzzed on the marble-topped table beside them. The caller ID read, "Thompson Legal." He ignored it. "Everything is arranged for the announcement at the gala," by the way Jessica said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Right after your speech. We'll have the press from Forbes and the New York Times there. It will be perfect." She was talking about the pregnancy announcement, making it a public spectacle. Damien felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of nausea. He thought of Ava, who had wanted to keep her own pregnancies private for the first few months, to cherish the secret between just the two of them. "Maybe we should wait," he said, the words surprising even himself. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Wait. Why, Damien, this solidifies everything. It shows a stable, forward-moving brand. It's what the board wants to see after the messy publicity of the divorce. She was right, of course. She was always right when it came to optics and strategy. He was a brand, a corporation unto himself, and she was his best publicist. He had chosen this path. He had signed the papers, vacated his old life, and built this new one. There was no going back. "Fine," he conceded, running a hand through his hair. After the speech. He glanced at his phone again. A new text from Thompson. "Damien, you need to see this. It's about the twins. Call me urgently." Jessica followed his gaze. "Is it her again?" she asked, her voice laced with ice. "Damien, you have to stop letting her get in your head. Your lawyers are handling it. That's what they're for. You pay them a fortune to keep your life clean." He looked from the phone to Jessica's flawless, expectant face. She was offering him a future one that was shiny, new, and free of messy attachments. A clean life. He slipped the phone into his pocket, silencing it. He would deal with it tomorrow. Tonight, he would be the king in his gilded cage, with his perfect queen at his side. The next few days were a blur of panicked phone calls and slammed doors for Ava. The bakery had to let her go. She'd missed too many shifts staying home with the children or rushing them to the clinic. The eviction notice now had a final, terrifying date stamped on it, the day of the Caldwell Foundation Gala. It felt like a sick joke, orchestrated by the universe. Her last-ditch attempt to reach Damien through his office was an exercise in futility. A series of polite but firm secretaries, each one a gatekeeper to his ivory tower, had blocked her at every turn. "Mr. Caldwell is in back-to-back meetings. Mr. Caldwell's personal matters are handled exclusively by his legal team. I'm sorry, Ms. Patterson, he is unavailable." She wasn't Mrs. Caldwell anymore. She was Ms. Patterson, a nuisance, a loose end he was trying to tie off. Her best friend Maria came over with a box of groceries and a heart full of fury. "I can't believe him, Ava. He's throwing a multi-million-dollar party while his own children— This is monstrous." "He doesn't know how bad it is, Maria," Ava said, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. She was trying to spoon some broth into Sophie's mouth, but the little girl just turned her head away, her body listless. "And whose fault is that?" Maria shot back, her dark eyes flashing. "He's chosen not to know. He has 100 people on his payroll who could find out in 5 minutes if he gave the order. He just doesn't care." Ava didn't want to believe that, but the evidence was mounting. The small, regular payments for child support arrived like clockwork, a cold, automated transaction that felt more like an insult than assistance. It was enough to cover basic rent and food, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to the medical tsunami that was about to hit them. It was money to keep them quiet, not money to keep them alive. The breaking point came on the morning of the gala. Noah woke up with a fever so high that Ava's old cheap thermometer couldn't even register it. He was delirious, muttering about circuits and stars, his small body convulsing. She rushed him to the emergency room at the city hospital, the one for people without premium insurance. The hours dragged by under the harsh fluorescent lights of the waiting room. Finally, a weary-looking doctor, a Dr. Evans, emerged. "The fever has broken for now," he said, his expression grim, "but Ms. Patterson, we are out of time. His neurological functions are beginning to show signs of degradation. Sophie is not far behind him. This experimental therapy we discussed, it's no longer a suggestion. It's their only chance." Ava's body went cold. "What happens if they don't get it?" Evans looked at her with profound pity. "The progression of this disease is rapid and cruel. We can manage their comfort, but we can't stop it. Manage their comfort." It was a sterile clinical way of saying, "Watch them die." A primal scream built in Ava's chest, but she choked it down. It wouldn't help Noah. It wouldn't help Sophie. She walked out of the hospital and into the relentless afternoon drizzle, her mind a blank slate of shock and terror. The city seemed to mock her with billboards advertising Damien's latest tech venture and glossy magazines in newsstands featuring his and Jessica's smiling faces under the headline, "Power Couple of the Year." They were celebrating. They were planning a party, while her world was ending. That's when the last vestiges of her pride finally crumbled, burned away by the ferocious, desperate fire of a mother's love. She would no longer be blocked by secretaries or lawyers. She would not be ignored. If he wouldn't come to her world of antiseptic and fear, she would drag it to his world of champagne and applause. She went back to the apartment, her movements robotic. She found the last of the children's pain medication and gave them both a dose. She dressed them in the warmest clothes they owned, wrapping them in blankets. Sophie was weak, but awake, her eyes wide with confusion. Noah was barely conscious. "Where are we going, Mommy?" Sophie whispered, her voice thin as a thread. Ava looked at her daughter, her heart a raw, open wound. She stroked her hair, tucking it behind her ear. "We're going to see Daddy," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "He needs to see you. He needs to remember." She had no invitation, no ticket. She had no idea how she would get past the security that would surely be surrounding an event of that magnitude. But she didn't care. She would stand in the street if she had to. She would scream until her lungs gave out. He would not be allowed to celebrate his new life while the best parts of his old one were dying. As she bundled her sick children into the back of a taxi she couldn't afford, the drizzle turned into a downpour. The sky opened up, and the heavens wept the tears she no longer had. It was the night of the gala. It was the night of her final stand. The grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel was a masterpiece of calculated illusion. Thousands of white orchids seemed to float in mid-air, suspended by invisible wires. The light from a dozen crystal chandeliers refracted through hundreds of champagne glasses, casting a diamond-like sparkle across the room. It was a scene of breathtaking opulence, meticulously designed by Jessica Montgomery to broadcast one clear message power. Jessica was in her element. She moved through the crowd of politicians, celebrities, and industry titans with a practiced grace, a word for everyone, her smile never faltering. She wore a stunning backless gown of crimson silk that clung to her every curve, a deliberate choice to accentuate the gentle, almost imperceptible swell of her belly. Tonight, she was not just Damian Caldwell's partner. She was the mother of his heir, the future Mrs. Caldwell. Damian stood at her side, a perfect accessory in his bespoke tuxedo. He smiled, he shook hands, he played his part. But his eyes were distant, his mind adrift. Thompson's text message from the other day had been gnawing at him. He had finally called his lawyer back that afternoon, only to be met with a stern, clipped warning. "Damian, her lawyer, is claiming the children's medical situation is dire," Thompson had said, his voice stripped of its usual professional deference. "They're talking about a rare genetic disorder. They're talking about experimental treatments costing a fortune. They're saying you've been unresponsive. I told you to handle it, Thompson." Damian had snapped, irritated. "Pay the bills. Set up a fund. I don't want to be involved in the day-to-day drama." "This may be beyond that," Thompson had insisted. "This sounds like it requires your personal attention. A genetic disorder. Damian, that has implications." Damian had brushed it off. It was a negotiation tactic, he'd told himself. Ava was getting desperate and exaggerating the situation to squeeze more money out of him. Jessica had said as much. "She knows the gala is tonight, Damian," she'd purred, adjusting his tie. "She's trying to ruin our moment. Don't let her." And so he hadn't. He'd ordered Thompson to offer a larger settlement and silenced his phone. Now, standing on a small stage at the front of the ballroom, he looked out at the sea of adoring faces. Jessica stood beside him, her hand resting proprietorially on his arm. He cleared his throat and began his speech. He spoke of corporate responsibility, of innovation for a better future of the new wing his foundation was funding at the Children's Hospital. The irony was a bitter pill he was forced to swallow. The applause was deafening. "And I couldn't do any of this," he continued, turning to Jessica, his voice amplified by the microphone, "without the vision and support of my incredible partner, Jessica." Jessica beamed a perfect picture of supportive elegance. "Together, we are not just building a future for this company, but for our own family as well." He paused for dramatic effect, just as they had rehearsed. Jessica placed a hand on her stomach. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a surge of excited murmurs. This was it. The grand announcement. The final public severing of his past. But as he opened his mouth to deliver the final line, a commotion at the back of the ballroom caught his attention. He could see his head of security, a large man named Frank, arguing with someone near the main entrance. A few heads in the crowd were beginning to turn. Jessica shot him a look, a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Ignore it. Finish." Damian tried to focus, but his gaze was drawn to the disturbance. He saw Frank gesturing emphatically, his face grim, trying to block the entrance. The gilded doors were slightly ajar, and through them Damian could see the chaotic flashing lights of the city at night, slick with rain. A cold, uneasy feeling began to creep up his spine. It was a primal instinct, a forgotten connection that suddenly sparked to life. He faltered the rest of his speech, dying on his lips. "Damian." Jessica whispered, her grip on his arm, tightening her nails, digging slightly into his sleeve. "Finish the announcement." But he couldn't. He handed the microphone to a stunned assistant, and stepped off the stage. His eyes locked on the ballroom doors. He started walking towards the back of the room, a path parting before him as bewildered guests stepped aside. "Damien, what are you doing?" Jessica hissed, following him. "The press is here. You're creating a scene." He ignored her. He had to know what was happening. As he got closer, he could hear the argument more clearly. "Sir, you can't go out there," Frank was saying. His voice strained. "It's a mess. Let us handle it. What is it?" Frank Damien demanded, his voice sharp, with an authority that had been missing all evening. "What's going on?" Frank's face was pale. He looked past Damien at Jessica, a silent apology in his eyes. "It's your ex-wife, sir. She's outside. She's not alone." Before Damien could process this, a gust of wind blew the heavy doors open, and in that moment the carefully constructed illusion of the gala shattered into a million pieces. The world outside the Astoria's grand entrance was a chaotic vortex of wind and rain. The storm, which had been a steady downpour all evening, had intensified into a furious squall. It whipped the perfectly coiffed hair of the paparazzi into disarray and sent valets scrambling for cover. The red carpet was a sodden, bleeding mess. And in the middle of it all stood Ava. She was a ghost from another life, a specter of his past crashing into his pristine present. Her hair was plastered to her skull, her cheap coat soaked through, clinging to a frame that looked fragile enough to snap. She wasn't shouting or making a scene. She was just standing there, shivering, her face a mask of resolute despair, her eyes fixed on the hotel entrance. But it wasn't just her. She was holding a small blanket-wrapped bundle in her arms, and clutching the hand of another small figure huddled beside her. Even from a distance, under the harsh glare of the hotel's spotlights, Damien could see the unnatural pallor of their faces. Security had formed a loose cordon around her, uncertain how to handle the situation. They were used to dealing with crazed fans or aggressive protesters, not a drenched woman, and two silent, sick children. Ava had taken the taxi as far as her money would go, which was 2 blocks away. She had carried Noah, who was now barely responsive, and held Sophie's hand as they walked the rest of the way through the torrential rain. They were both soaked to the bone, their small bodies trembling with cold and fever. Sophie coughed, a deep rattling sound that tore through the night. When they reached the entrance, the wall of security had been immediate and unyielding. "Ma'am, you can't be here. This is a private event. I need to see Damien Caldwell," Ava had said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her chattering teeth. "I'm Ava. I'm the mother of his children." The guards exchanged glances. They had their orders. Jessica had been very specific. Under no circumstances was Ava Patterson to be allowed anywhere near the property. Ava saw the pity and dismissal in their eyes. She saw the flashes of cameras from the press line reporters, sensing a story far more interesting than a charity donation. Humiliation washed over her, hot and sickening, but she held her ground. She would not be moved. She would wait, even if she froze to death on this very spot. Then, just as her strength began to fail her, just as Noah's dead weight in her arms felt impossibly heavy, a wave of dizziness swept over her. The flashing lights of the cameras, the shouting of the guards, the cold rain, it all began to spin. Her knees buckled. With a soft cry, Ava collapsed onto the wet pavement, still instinctively shielding Noah's body with her own. Sophie cried out, "Mommy!" her small voice lost in the howl of the wind. And that was the scene that greeted Damien as he pushed past his own security and burst out into the storm. Time seemed to slow down. For Damien, the opulent ballroom behind him, with its Vivaldi and champagne, ceased to exist. His world narrowed to the tableau of utter devastation on the rain-slicked pavement before him. Ava on her knees, struggling to get up. Sophie weeping beside her, tugging on her arm. And the still small bundle in her arms that he recognized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock. Noah. He started forward, a guttural sound escaping his throat, but Jessica's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. Her grip was like steel. "Don't," she commanded, her voice a low, vicious whisper. "Damien, think. The cameras are everywhere. She's doing this for attention, for money. It's a pathetic, desperate act. Let security handle it. We'll go back inside and release a statement tomorrow." Her words were logical. They were strategic. They were the kind of advice she always gave him, the kind that had guided his public life so successfully. But as he looked at the scene, something inside him broke. This wasn't a PR problem. This was a father's nightmare. He shook off her hand and strode into the rain, the icy drops soaking his tuxedo in seconds. The paparazzi erupted into a frenzy, their flashes creating a strobing, surreal light. "Ava," he yelled over the storm. She looked up, her face streaked with rain and tears. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a bone-deep exhaustion and a plea so profound it struck him to his core. "They're sick, Damien," she gasped, her voice ragged. "They're so sick." Jessica had followed him, an umbrella now held over her head by a frantic security guard. She stood just at the edge of the curb, a look of pure disgust on her face. She saw her perfectly orchestrated evening, her grand announcement, her moment of triumph all dissolving in a puddle of dirty rainwater. How utterly pathetic, Jessica said, her voice just loud enough for Damien to hear over the din. She took a step forward, a cruel smile gracing her lips. "Look at you, Ava. Crawling back using your children as props. Did you really think this would work?" She turned to Damien, her expression softening into one of feigned sympathy. "Darling, don't fall for it. She's just trying to manipulate you. These children are her problem, not yours. We have our own family to think about now." That was the moment. The final clarifying second. Her problem, not yours. The words hung in the air, more chilling than the wind. Damien looked down at the children. He saw Sophie's face, so much like his own, twisted in fear and confusion. He pushed the blanket back from the other bundle and saw his son. Noah's eyes were closed. His skin had a bluish tint around his lips, and his breathing was terrifyingly shallow. He looked small, breakable. He remembered Thompson's words. A rare genetic disorder. It has implications, genetic. From a mother and a father. Everything Jessica had told him, that Ava was poisoning them against him, that she was exaggerating, that she was using them, it all crumbled into dust. This wasn't manipulation. This was real. This was a mother's last desperate gamble to save her children, his children. A rage unlike anything he had ever known surged through him. It was a white-hot cleansing fire, burning away a year's worth of lies, selfishness, and willful ignorance. He turned his head slowly, his gaze falling on Jessica. Her smug smile faltered slightly under the intensity of his glare. He pointed a trembling finger at the two small figures on the ground. His voice, when it came out, was not a whisper. It was a raw, primal roar that cut through the storm, silenced the paparazzi, and echoed in the stunned silence. "These are my children." The world stopped. Jessica's face went white. The security guards froze. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. In that instant, Damien Caldwell, the billionaire, the titan of industry, was gone. All that was left was a father horrified by what he saw and what he had done. The silence that followed Damien's roar was absolute. It was a vacuum pulling all the air from the space around them. Jessica stood frozen, her smug smile wiped clean from her face, replaced by a mask of disbelief and fury. The press, after a moment of stunned inaction, went into overdrive, their cameras flashing like 1,000 lightning bugs. Damien didn't notice. His entire being was focused on his children. He knelt on the wet pavement, his expensive suit forgotten, and gently took Noah from Ava's trembling arms. The boy was terrifyingly light. A wave of panic and regret so profound it almost buckled him washed over him. How had he let it get to this? Frank, he barked at his head of security. Get the car. Not the limo, the town car. Now, and call Dr. Alistair Finch. Tell him it's a Caldwell family emergency. Tell him to meet me at Mount Sinai, whatever it takes. Dr. Finch was the best pediatric specialist in the country, a man whose hospital wing Damien had just pledged to fund. Security scrambled into action. Damien carefully lifted Noah, cradling his son's head. He looked at Ava, who was still on the ground, struggling to help a weeping Sophie to her feet. "Give her to me," he said, his voice softer, now laced with an emotion he hadn't felt in years, shame. He managed to get both children into his arms, a feat of desperate strength. "Get in the car, Ava," he commanded gently. Jessica finally found her voice. "Damien, what are you doing? You can't just leave. What about our guests? What about our announcement?" He turned to face her, his eyes cold as ice chips. The man she had so carefully molded was gone. "Go back inside, Jessica," he said, his voice dangerously low. "The party's over." He turned his back on her and carried his children to the waiting car, leaving Jessica standing alone in the rain, the umbrella-wielding guard having abandoned her to help get the car doors open. For the first time, she looked completely powerless, a queen stranded outside the gates of her own castle. The ride to the hospital was a blur of frantic energy. Damien held Noah, while Ava clutched Sophie, murmuring soothing words. For the first time in over a year, they were a family unit again, brought together by the worst possible circumstances. Damien couldn't stop looking at them, at the dark circles under their eyes, the frailness of their limbs. These were not the vibrant, healthy children he remembered. They were ghosts, and he had been haunting them from a distance. At Mount Sinai, a team was waiting. Dr. Finch, a sharp, no-nonsense man in his 50s, took one look at the children and started barking orders. They were whisked away to the pediatric ICU. Damien and Ava were left in a private waiting room, a sterile, silent space that felt like a courtroom. For a long time, neither spoke. Ava just sat wrapped in a hospital blanket, shivering. Damien paced his mind, racing, piecing together the fragments of information he had so carelessly ignored. Genetic disorder. Unresponsive. Dire. His phone buzzed. It was Mr. Thompson. "Damien, I saw the news feeds." "I'm on my way," his lawyer said. "What do you need?" "I need to know everything," Damien said, his voice raw. "Everything you tried to tell me. Everything I didn't listen to." There was a pause on the other end. "I'll forward you every email, every medical report I was sent. But Damien, there's something else. Something I was looking into this afternoon after you dismissed my concerns. What is it?" "It's about Jessica Montgomery, Thompson," said, his tone grim. "You're not going to like it." Just then, Dr. Finch entered the room, his face grave. "Mr. Caldwell, Ms. Patterson. We've stabilized them, but they are in critical condition. The diagnosis your previous doctors made ex-ALD appears to be correct. We're lucky you got them here tonight. A few more hours." He let the sentence hang in the air. "The treatment," Ava whispered. the gene therapy. Is it possible? It's their only shot, Finch confirmed. We can start preparing them immediately. It's incredibly expensive, and insurance won't touch it. That is not an issue, Damien said instantly, his eyes locking with Ava's. Do it. Whatever it takes. I will fund the entire trial if I have to. A single tear traced a path down Ava's cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a relief so overwhelming it was painful. As Dr. Finch left to make the arrangements, Damien's phone chimed with an incoming email from Thompson. The subject line was Jessica Montgomery, urgent. He opened it. It contained a single scanned document and a short message from his lawyer. Damien. I had a private investigator look into her. This is a copy of a contract from a surrogate agency in California. It was signed 2 months ago. The listed biological mother is an anonymous egg donor. Damien stared at the screen, the world tilting on its axis. The contract was ironclad. Jessica wasn't pregnant. She had hired a surrogate. The child she was carrying wasn't biologically hers. And given her lies, it was almost certainly not his either. The entire foundation of his new life, the baby, the future, the family, was a lie. A calculated, brilliant, and utterly devastating illusion. He thought of her hand on her stomach at the gala, her triumphant smile. It had all been a performance, a power play to secure her position and his fortune. He sank into a chair, the phone slipping from his numb fingers. He had thrown away his real family for a fraud. He had abandoned his dying children for a woman who was building their future on a bedrock of deceit. The weight of his own colossal foolishness crashed down on him, and in the sterile silence of the hospital waiting room, Damien Caldwell finally began to weep. The elevator ride to the penthouse was a silent, sterile ascent through Damien's personal hell. Each floor chimed a small, mocking bell, tolling the end of his gilded life. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the brutal revelations of the past few hours. The man who had entered the gala that evening, confident, arrogant, and willfully blind, was dead. In his place was a stranger, a man haunted by the pale, fragile faces of his own children. He expected the penthouse to be empty, a silent tomb. Instead, he found Jessica waiting for him in the center of the vast living room. She had changed out of her ruined gown and into a pair of cream-colored silk pajamas. A glass of what he now knew was simply water sat untouched on the table beside her. Her hair was perfect, her makeup reapplied. She had rebuilt her mask of composure, ready for one last performance. "Darling, you're back," she said, her voice a carefully modulated balm of concern. She rose and moved towards him. "I was so worried. I've been calling the hospital, but they wouldn't give me any information." "How are the children? Are they—" Damien walked right past her, as if she were a piece of furniture, his movements stiff and heavy. He went to the bar, his back to her, and poured a whiskey. His hand was shaking so badly that the neck of the decanter rattled against the rim of the crystal glass. "This is all a terrible, terrible mess," she continued, her voice following him, undeterred. She was regrouping, shifting her strategy. "But we can fix this. I've already spoken to Patricia at our PR firm. She's drafting a statement. We'll be proactive. We'll frame it as a compassionate, albeit dramatic, response to a clearly troubled woman. We can announce the formation of a new pediatric health trust managed by our foundation. We'll make you look like a hero rushing to the aid of your estranged family. We can still control the narrative, Damien." He finally turned the glass in his hand, his eyes two black holes in his pale face. The emptiness in them scared her. "Narrative," he repeated the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. "You think this is about a narrative?" "Everything is about the narrative," she insisted, taking a step closer. "Damien, don't let that woman's street theater stunt cloud your judgment. She played you. But we are smarter than her. We have a future. Our baby. "Stop," he said. The word was not loud, but it had the force of a physical blow. It froze her mid-sentence. "Just stop talking." He set his glass down, walked over to the slate coffee table where his tablet lay, and woke the screen. He didn't have to search for the email from Thompson. It was still open. He swiped to the scanned contract for the surrogacy, its clinical legalistic text a stark monument to her deceit. He didn't throw the tablet at her. He placed it on the table in front of her, a quiet, final judgment. Jessica's eyes darted down to the screen. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. He saw it all in a flash flood of expressions, the sharp intake of breath, the flicker of raw panic, the frantic calculation as her mind raced for an escape route, and the final dawning horror of being caught. It's not what it looks like," she stammered. Her voice losing its silky smoothness, becoming thin and reedy. "There were complications. With my health, I couldn't risk the pregnancy myself. I was going to tell you, I wanted to surprise you to ensure everything was perfect for our baby." "Perfect?" Damien let out a laugh, a dry, hollow sound that held no humor. It was the sound of something breaking. "You mean perfectly staged? Was the anonymous egg donor part of the surprise as well? Was any of it real, Jessica? Or was it all just an elaborate merger and acquisition with my life as the target company?" Her composure finally snapped. The desperation became rage. "I did it for us," she cried, her voice rising, echoing in the cavernous room. "I did it to give you what you said you wanted, a clean slate, a perfect heir, a perfect family without the messy, inconvenient baggage from your past. I saw how weak you were when it came to her and those children. They were an anchor dragging you down. I was securing our future. I was giving you the legacy you deserve." Her confession, so brazen and unapologetic, was the final clarifying blow. He saw her with perfect, hideous clarity, a brilliant strategist who had viewed his life, his emotions, and his children as assets and liabilities on a balance sheet. He felt a sudden, profound calm. The rage was gone, replaced by something colder, heavier. It was the weight of his own monumental stupidity. "My children," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout, "are lying in an ICU fighting for their lives because I was weak enough to believe in your balance sheet, because I listened to you, because I traded their lives for an illusion." He turned and walked towards the master bedroom. "Get your things," he said, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on the door. "I want you out of this apartment by sunrise. Your name will be removed from the building's security list. Your access cards and accounts will be deactivated. My lawyers will messenger a severance package to an address of your choosing. It will be generous. In return, you will sign a non-disclosure agreement so airtight that you will not be able to so much as whisper my name to a stranger for the rest of your life. If you refuse, or if I ever hear of you again, I will dedicate a significant portion of my fortune to systematically exposing and destroying you. Am I clear?" Tears hot with fury and utter defeat streamed down Jessica's face. The game was over. She had lost. "You'll regret this, Damien," she spat, her last pathetic attempt at a threat. "She will never take you back. You'll be alone." He paused at the bedroom door, his hand on the handle, and looked back at her for the last time. "This isn't about her taking me back," he said, his voice weary. "This is about me earning the right to look my children in the eye again. It's about me learning how to be a father, a concept you would never understand." He stepped into the bedroom and closed the door, the soft click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the silent penthouse. The weeks that followed were a penance. Damien shed his corporate skin and lived in the beige antiseptic world of the hospital. He learned the nurses' names, the rhythm of the beeping machines, the subtle shifts in his children's breathing. He sat for hours watching Ava. He watched her smooth Sophie's hair read to Noah in a soft, steady voice and argue with doctors about medication dosages with a fierce intelligence he'd forgotten she possessed. He saw her strength not as an innate quality, but as a conscious choice she made every single minute of every single day. Their interactions were brief, functional, and excruciatingly polite. He would bring her coffee. She would thank him without meeting his eyes. He would take over watching the children so she could sleep for an hour in a cot. She would return and resume her post without a word. They were two planets orbiting the same suns, trapped in a shared gravitational pull, but never touching. One night, Noah had a nightmare, thrashing in his sleep and crying out. Damien was there in an instant, gently shaking him awake. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe." "Dad's here," he whispered. Noah's eyes fluttered open, wide with fear. "I want Mommy," he whimpered, and the words were a knife in Damien's chest. He simply nodded and went to wake Ava, retreating to the shadows of the room, as she soothed their son back to sleep. He was a provider, a guardian, a source of funds, but he was not yet a comfort. He had not earned that right. He finally found a moment to speak to her one evening when a nurse had convinced her to take a walk. He found her in the hospital's small, quiet chapel, staring at the stained glass window. "Ava," he said softly from the doorway. She didn't turn. "The doctor said Sophie's enzyme levels are responding better than they expected." "I know. It's good news," he said, taking a hesitant step into the room. The space between them felt 1,000 miles wide. I came to tell you something. I spoke with Thompson. The deed to our old house, your house, has been transferred back into your name free and clear. And I've established an irrevocable trust. For you, for Noah, for Sophie. It's managed by a third party. The funds are astronomical. You will never have to worry about money or a place to live or a medical bill ever again. Ava was silent for a long time, her back still to him. Finally, she asked, "Why are you telling me this, Damien?" "Because I need you to know this isn't a transaction," he said, his voice cracking with the effort of holding himself together. "This isn't me trying to buy my way back into your life. It's restitution. It's the very least I can do. I can't take back the past year, Ava. I can't erase the memory of your calls going unanswered or the terror you must have felt when you saw that eviction notice." He finally broke the words, coming out in a choked sob. "God, Ava, to think of you all alone facing that, while it is a failure so profound, I don't think I'll ever recover from it." She finally turned, and her eyes were clear, not with anger, but with a deep, bottomless sorrow. "The money fixes a problem, Damien," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's a tool. It gives our children the security they deserve. But it doesn't fix the memory of me begging your assistant to let me speak to you while my child was screaming with fever in the next room. It doesn't fix the fact that you chose to believe I was a liar. Trust isn't a house or a bank account. It's a delicate thing. And you didn't just break it. You pulverized it." He flinched, as if she'd struck him. It was the truth, and it was a truth he had to accept. "I know," he whispered, his head bowed in shame. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I am going to spend every day for the rest of my life trying to be the father that Noah and Sophie deserve." Weeks later, the miracle they had been praying for began to bloom. The gene therapy was taking root. The children's energy returned in small but significant bursts. One afternoon, Damien walked into their new private room, upgraded from the ICU, and stopped in the doorway. Ava was sitting on the bed reading a story to Sophie, who was actually giggling. And Noah, for the first time in months, was sitting up on his own, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to connect 2 wires on a small electronics kit Damien had brought him. He looked up and saw Damien, and a tiny hesitant smile touched his lips before he turned back to his project. It was a small thing, a fleeting moment, but for Damien, it was everything. He was still an outsider, a man standing in the doorway of a life he had forfeited. He hadn't been forgiven. Their family wasn't magically whole, but as he watched his son's small, clever hands at work and heard his daughter's laugh, he knew he had been given something more precious than forgiveness. He had been given a chance to rebuild. It would not be a restoration of the old life, but the painstaking construction of a new one, brick by brick, moment by moment, built on a foundation of humility and an unwavering promise to never, ever look away again. It was the first stone, and he would spend a lifetime laying the rest. In the end, this wasn't a story about a billionaire reclaiming his lost love. It was the story of a mother's ferocious will to save her children and a father's painful awakening to the things that truly matter. Ava Patterson, armed with nothing but a mother's love, faced down an empire and won the only prize that mattered, her children's future. Damien Caldwell learned the harshest lesson of his life, that a true fortune isn't measured in stock prices, but in bedtime stories and fevered brows. Their family was not magically healed, but a new foundation was laid, built on remorse, resilience, and the fragile, beautiful hope of a second chance. What do you think? Can a man who has made such a terrible mistake ever truly earn forgiveness? Is a mother's love the most powerful force on earth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful drama, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories that feel like they're torn from real life. Thank you for listening.